No civilians near my bird. You hear me? You see that yellow line under your boots? You're standing inside it." The voice cut across the flight deck of the USS Cape Gloucester, louder than the turbine spinning 2 spots down. Captain Beckett Driscoll came across the steel at a hard walk. Deck boots slapping, a clipboard clamped under one arm, a green flight deck float coat zipped to his throat. The morning was bright, and the wind off the bow ran a steady 22 knots, salt and jet exhaust folded into it. On spot 3, a CH-53E Super Stallion sat turning, 7 rotor blades slicing a disk of moving air, the downwash flattening the legs of everyone within 40 feet. A woman stood a meter inside the foul line, worn flight suit faded at the knees and the cuffs, no rank on the collar, no name tape on the chest. A plain contractor lanyard hung at her sternum, a laminated card turned to the wind. She was not looking at Driscoll. She was looking at the sling crew under the 5-3, at the lay of the cargo pendant, at the way the deck handlers leaned into the wash. "I'm talking to you." Driscoll stopped in front of her, close, using his height. "This is a flight deck, not a sightseeing tour, not a place for a clipboard tourist to go wandering. Turn around, walk yourself back to that island, before I have somebody walk you." She did not turn around. She did not argue. She read the deck the way a sailor reads weather, a glance that took the whole sky at once and gave nothing back. So he grabbed her. He took her left arm above the elbow and hauled 2 steps backward, hard enough to rock her off her line. A man expecting a stumble. A man expecting a small, satisfying loss of dignity in front of his crew. The marshalers near the island laughed, the easy laugh of men who have learned that laughing with the loud one is safer than not. She did not stumble. She rolled with the pull, found her feet, and stepped clear of the rotor arc, but on her own line, not his. The line a person walks who has cleared 100 rotor arcs in the dark. Her weight stayed even through both boots. Her free hand never came up. The watch on her left wrist was turned inward, the face against the soft of the arm. "Understood," she said. One word. Flat. Final. It landed on Driscoll like a coin dropped into deep water. No splash he could use. A man who shoves expects a shove back or a flinch or a complaint he can answer and win. He had gotten a single word, and a woman already standing exactly where she had meant to stand all along, as though his hand on her arm had been a suggestion she was free to take or leave. For half a heartbeat, he did not know what to do with that. Then he covered the not knowing the way he covered everything, with volume. Driscoll thumbed the lanyard, tilted it to read it, and smirked. "Garrity, defense liaison." He let it drop. "Of course they sent me a liaison. Vasey." He raised his voice without turning his head. "Babysit the tourist. Keep her off my spots." Staff Sergeant Grover Vasey ambled over, thumbs in his float coat pockets, and parked himself a pace behind her, like a man assigned to a traffic cone. The woman called Garrity said nothing more. She moved to the deck edge net, set her back to the safety line, and watched the Super Stallion and its sling crew with eyes that did not stop moving. The load, the wire, the handlers, the wind, the island, all of it, on a loop. 40 feet up, behind the salt-streaked glass of flight deck control, a master gunnery sergeant set down his coffee. Galen Merrick had crewed flight decks for 28 years, and the one thing 28 years teaches a man is how people move. The loud ones move to be seen. The scared ones move to be small. And then there is the third kind, the kind who clears a turning rotor without flinching and without hurrying, who steps to the exact edge of safe and stops there, who reads a deck like a page they wrote. He had seen a woman move like that exactly once. A different ocean. A worse night. 12 years gone, and the body remembers a thing the mind misfiles. He leaned toward the glass, He watched her head turn, half a second before the rest of them, toward the island, toward an engine note that had not yet cleared the superstructure. Then the inbound bird came around the island, and everyone else heard it too. Merrick frowned. He did not know yet why. He only knew that the captain who ran his flight deck had just put his hand on someone, and laughed, and walked away certain. On the deck-edge net, Linnea Garrity watched a ship she would own in 2 days. The captain's laugh carried back to her on the wind. She let it land where it would. She turned the watch a quarter inch and counted, without moving her lips, to 3. 2 days. In 2 days, every fault on this deck would be hers to sign for. She intended to know them all first. The Super Stallion's blades beat the air. The sling crew worked, and a man who had thrown a colonel off a flight deck stood with his back to her, telling his marshalers a story about tourists who do not belong, never once feeling the cold that should have come up his spine. The wind held at 22 knots. The morning stayed bright, and nothing about it warned him. The sling load went wrong on the second lift of the morning. Garrity saw it before anyone on the deck. A Tsindage-53 came to a 40-foot hover over Spot 2, with an external load slung beneath it. A netted pallet of cargo, 800 pounds, riding on a 4-leg pendant. The handlers had hooked it fast and waved the bird up. But the aft leg of the pendant had taken the load wrong, and the wire was unlaying under tension, the outer strand separating, a slow unwinding that no one watching the bird would catch, because no one watching the bird was watching the wire. She crossed 8 feet of deck to Vasi and said 4 words into the noise. "Your aft leg's parting." Vasi looked at her, the way a man looks at a tourist who has opinions. "Stay behind the line, lady. 800 pounds on 3 legs in 10 seconds, she said. Even. Specific. Set it down. Something in the numbers reached him where the warning had not. Vasi looked up at the pendant. He looked again. Then he keyed his deck communications and called the bird to set the load down. Now, easy, on the spot. The Super Stallion eased the pallet to the steel. The handlers swarmed it, and the aft leg of the pendant, when they unhooked it, had unlaid to 3 bright strands, frayed and humming, a finger width from letting go. Private First Class Declan Murphy, 19 years old and 4 months on the deck, went pale under his cranial. He had been standing under the load. Driscoll arrived at a run, took in the frayed leg, and took over the scene the way he took over every scene, loudly and from the front. He inspected the pendant. He pointed. He told 2 handlers what they should have seen. Then he keyed his radio and reported up to flight deck control that his deck team had caught a rigging fault and prevented a dropped load. "Good catch by my crew," he said. "That's what a trained deck does." He did not look at the woman in the flight suit. He had decided, already, that she had not been there. 2 handlers who had seen the whole thing exchanged a look and said nothing, because a chief who needs the credit is a chief who remembers who tried to take it from him. The morning went on. The Super Stallion lifted its pallet a second time, clean, and carried it forward, and the deck folded the near miss away into the long list of things that almost happened, and therefore, to most of the men working, did not count. Garrity counted it. She wrote the time in the green notebook, and the weight, and the single word, pendant, and moved on. Murphy looked at her, though. When the deck settled, the boy crossed to where she stood and asked her, half shouting over the turbines, how she had seen it. She told him in the deck's own shorthand. The lay of the wire, the angle the load took when it lifted, the note the rigging made under strain, a half-tone she had heard go wrong before it looked wrong. Murphy listened, and the thing that moved across his young face wasn't gratitude. It was arithmetic. The contractor everyone was laughing at knew this deck better than the chief who ran it. Up in flight deck control, Merrick came down the ladder on a pretext and walked to the spot. He checked nothing he needed to check. He watched the woman called Garrity orient on an inbound bird by engine note, her chin coming around a beat before the radar tag updated on the glass, before the aircraft cleared the island. 12 years ago, he had watched a major do exactly that on a landing zone the size of a tennis court, in the dark, with the world coming apart. He had thought then that she could hear helicopters before God sent them. He went back up the ladder and pulled the flight deck access log. He scrolled to the morning's entries. There it was. Garrity. Logged as Defense Liaison. No rank, no unit. A name he had read 1,000 times on 1,000 manifests, and a name that, today, would not lie flat. 12 years is a long time. But the body remembers what the mind files wrong. Merrick had seen that head turn toward an engine he could not yet hear. He had seen it in a different ocean, on a worse night. And the man whose life she saved that night had been him. He stood in the control booth with the logbook open and his coffee going cold, and did not say the thing forming in his chest. Not yet. A master gunnery sergeant does not say a colonel's name into a flight deck on a guess. Below him, on the steel, the frayed pendant lay coiled like a snake that had not gotten to strike. And the woman who had seen it was being shadowed toward the hangar bay by a staff sergeant who thought he was minding a tourist, while the captain who ran the deck told the story of his crew's good catch to anyone on the net who would listen. The wind held. The birds turned. And Merrick watched a name on a page refuse to settle, and felt the deck tilt under a certainty he was not ready to speak. By the afternoon, Captain Driscoll had given her a name, and the name had spread. The tourist. He said it in the hangar bay, and he said it on the deck, and he said it on the net, and his deck crew picked it up the way crews pick up a chief's contempt, because a man's nicknames are a test of who is on his side. The tourist did not belong. The tourist had wandered. The tourist had a clipboard and a lanyard, and no idea what a real flight deck was. Garrity absorbed it. She had absorbed worse. She stood at the deck edge, set her back to the safety line, and counted to 3 behind her teeth, while a captain performed his ownership of a ship she had read in a single morning, better than he had read it in a tour. He froze her out next. Word came down through Vasi that the liaison was not cleared into the hangar bay during flight quarters. A petty thing. Flight quarters ran most of the day, but it kept her on the weather deck, in the wind, away from the warm steel where the crew worked. She complied without a word. She used the time the way an incoming commander uses time. She mapped the ship, the fueling stations, the fittings, the fire mains, the tie-down chains. The 2 birds spotted forward, and the CH-53E pushed aft. The exits, the choke points, the places a thing could go wrong, and the seconds it would take to reach them. A 19-year-old got it right when no one else did. Lance Corporal Casey Osland had a face that had not yet learned to hide what it thought. And what it thought, watching Driscoll mock the quiet woman in the flight suit, was that this was wrong. He did not laugh with the others. Late in the afternoon, when the wind had a bite, and Garrity had been standing in it for 2 hours, he crossed the deck with a water bottle and held it out. "Ma'am," he said, "you should drink something. Wind'll dry you out worse than the sun." She took it. She read his name tape. Oslund. The way she read everything, once and completely. "Thank you, Lance Corporal Oslund," she said. He nodded, embarrassed, and went back to his post. He never knew that he was the only man on the flight deck who had gotten it right. Garrity watched the boy go and made a small, private note of him, the way she noted everything. But this note she kept somewhere warmer than the green book. Decency under a loud man's eye is rarer than courage under fire, because fire at least gives a person an excuse to be brave. A flight deck on an ordinary afternoon gives no excuses at all. Osland had crossed 40 feet of steel to hand a stranger a bottle of water for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, with a captain watching who would remember it and make him pay. She had spent 25 years looking for that exact quality in people and promoting it wherever she found it, because it does not come from training. It comes from somewhere a person either has or does not. When the deck was quiet, Garrity took a small green notebook from her thigh pocket and wrote in it times, names, the frayed pendant, the grounding she would check tomorrow, the captain's voice and the captain's hand and the captain's clipboard. She wasn't keeping score. She was taking inventory. In 2 days, every fault on this deck would be hers to fix, and she intended to know them all before she signed her name under them. If you have ever watched someone in charge mistake quiet for weak, watched a loud man decide that a person who does not fight back must not be worth fearing, then you already know how this flight deck feels right now. Stay with her. It is worth it. Subscribe to Honor Tales and walk the rest of this with us, because the deck is about to learn exactly who it has been shouting at. The sun went down over the water in a long red line. Garrity closed the notebook. Down on the steel, Driscoll ran his evening recovery, loud and certain. The king of a kingdom 40 feet by 800. And a 19-year-old who had handed a colonel a bottle of water and called her ma'am out of plain decency slept that night with a clear conscience he had not yet earned, and a courage he had not yet been asked to spend. He would be asked. The deck did not know it. The captain did not know it. But the asking was already on the way, riding 2 days out on a quiet logistics bird, wearing a flight suit with no rank on the collar, counting to 3. On the second day, Driscoll stopped using his mouth and started using paper. He wrote her up. Garrity, Defense Liaison, the form read, for entering a foul deck and interfering with flight operations during an external lift evolution. He signed it in a hand that pressed hard enough to dent the page. He had Vasi witness it. Then he found Osland near the fuel pits and held the form out with a pen. Initial the witness block, Lance Corporal. Osland looked at the form. He looked at the woman it named, standing in the wind 40 feet away, who had caught the load that nearly came down on Murphy. "Sir," he said, "I didn't see her interfere with anything. I saw her call the load." "That's not what I asked." "I can't initial it, sir. It's not what happened." Driscoll's jaw worked. He took the pen back, found Vasi, and Vasi signed it without reading it, because Vasi had learned long ago which signature kept him warm. Driscoll took the next step. He had her flight deck pass downgraded and told flight deck control to keep the tourist off his spots. The order came up to Merrick at the control console. Merrick listened to it, said, "Copy," in a voice with nothing in it, and then quietly left her access live on his own authority, because a master gunnery sergeant who has begun to suspect a thing protects the person he suspects it about. And then the deck nearly killed somebody, and the tourist stopped it. At the forward hot refueling station, a super stallion sat with engines turning, taking on fuel, a fat black hose running from the deck point to the bird. Garrity, on her wide, slow loop of the ship, saw what the fuel crew did not. The grounding cable, the bond between aircraft and deck that bleeds off static so a spark cannot find vapor, had been clipped to a painted fitting. Paint is an insulator. The bond was not made. Fuel was flowing, a turbine was hot, and a charge had nowhere to go. She did not call for permission. She crossed to the grounding point, popped the clip, scraped it to bare metal, and reseated it on bare steel, and put her body between a young fueler and the bird as she did it. "Ground's not bonded," she said. "Stop the flow." The fuel crew chief looked, swore under his breath, and stopped the flow. The bond now read true. The fueler, white-faced, was clear. Fuel and a bad ground and a hot turbine. She'd seen what that arithmetic costs, had smelled it once, on a deck a long way from here, on a man who had not walked away. She fixed it with 2 hands and 4 words, and let Captain Driscoll take the next breath he did not know he had almost lost. The young fueler found her an hour later on the weather deck and tried to thank her, and could not get the words to come in the right order. She told him it was nothing. Then she told him the thing that was not nothing, to check his own bonds every time, every single time, with his own eyes, and to trust no one's word for a thing that could take a flight deck down to the waterline. He nodded the way the young nod when an old truth lands in them for the first time. She did not tell him that she had once carried a man off a burning deck and felt the cloth of his uniform come away in her hands. Some lessons you give people without the cost attached and let them earn the cost later. Somewhere you are not. Driscoll, when he heard, did not thank her. He could not afford to. To thank her was to admit she had been right twice on his deck in 2 days, and his deck was the only kingdom he had. So he doubled down on the paper. He drafted a request to have the civilian liaison removed from the ship at the next mail run, citing a pattern of unsafe interference, and routed it up the chain with his signature at the bottom. He was without the faintest idea that he was doing it, signing the document that would one day be read back to him in a different room, with a different woman's rank typed across the top of it. Merrick watched the request go up and said nothing. He had stopped wondering who the woman was. He had started wondering who the captain was. A man who fakes a flight deck violation, fakes a witness, fakes a watch. What does a man like that fake when nobody is reading the log? 2 decks down, Driscoll filed his paper and felt, for one warm moment, like he had won. Merrick could not let it go. So on the evening of the 2nd day, he went looking for her. He found her where he expected to, at the deck edge net on the starboard side, aft, where the wind came off the quarter and the wake rolled out silver under a half moon. She stood with her back to the safety line and her face to the water, and she did not startle when he came up beside her, because she had heard his boots on the non-skid 4 paces out and known the weight of the man making them. He did not ask the question. A master gunnery sergeant does not ask a colonel if she is a colonel. He told her a story instead, sideways, the only way a careful man tells a dangerous truth. "I crewed a 5-3 a long time ago, ma'am," Merrick said, looking at the water, not at her. "Bad landing zone. Place we should never have set down. We took fire on short final. Pilot put us on the deck anyway, and we sat there in it, taking rounds through the cabin, because the ground commander would not lift without her last man." He let the wake roll. "You ever hear a story like that?" "I've heard it," Garrity said. 3 words. She did not look away from the water, and she did not say more, and she did not deny him, which was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it. Merrick nodded slowly. He let a long breath go into the wind. Thought so. He went that same night to find Driscoll, and he tried to do the decent thing, the thing that would have saved the captain from himself. He found him in the air officer's stateroom and spoke to him off the record, man to man, NCO to officer, in the careful flat voice of a man trying to hand someone a rope. "Sir, I'm going to say a thing once, and you can do what you want with it. Walk the liaison business back. All of it. The write-up, the removal request, the pass. If she's who I'm starting to think she is, you want to be a very long way from any of it." Driscoll laughed. He was certain of his deck, and certain of his rank, and certain of his version of the last 2 days. And certainty is the most comfortable thing a man can wear and the hardest to take off. "She's a contractor with a clipboard, Master Guns," he said. "I appreciate the concern. Stay in your lane." Merrick looked at him for a moment, the way a man looks at a building he already knows is on fire. Then he said, "Aye, sir," and left, because he had handed over the rope and watched the man set it down. He stood in the passageway a moment after the hatch shut, listening to the ship work around him, and thought about the kind of officer who cannot take a rope when it is held out to him. He had known a few across 28 years. They were always certain, and they were always alone in a way they mistook for strength, and they always, in the end, fell from a height they had built for themselves, one comfortable lie at a time. Merrick had no pity left over for them. He saved what he had for the young ones they took down on the way. There was one more thing that night. In heavy seas off the quarter, a Gold Star widow named Fay Ledbetter, aboard for the dedication of the ship's new memorial board, her husband's name among the etched, lost her footing on a wet ladder well. Garrity was there. She took the woman's weight without drama, set her own boots in the angle of the ladder, and walked her down step by step, one hand under the elbow, saying little, saying enough. Mrs. Ledbetter thanked her and asked her name. Garrity, she said. Nothing else. The crew that mocked her did not see it, because the crew that mocked her was never looking when it counted. Back in flight deck control, Merrick pulled Driscoll's logs to verify a detail for the morning's flight schedule. He was not looking for trouble. Trouble found him anyway. Watches signed for that the swipe records did not support. A flight quarters watch logged as stood by a man the card reader placed 2 decks below at the time. He read it twice. He did not yet know what it would matter for. He filed it, the way he filed everything, in the steel drawer of a memory that did not lose things. Somewhere on this ship was a logbook that did not match the truth, and a man who did not know whose arm he had grabbed. If you want to be standing on that flight deck when the deck finds out, and you do, then subscribe, because the next 2 parts are the reason you came. 2 men now knew that something was wrong on the flight deck of the Cape Gloucester. One was the chief who kept a colonel's access alive in secret. The other was the captain who still believed, sleeping soundly 2 decks down, that the danger on his deck was her. That night, alone in a borrowed stateroom 3 decks below the flight deck, the woman the deck called the tourist became, for the audience and no one else, exactly who she was. The stateroom was small, and it was not hers. A junior officer had been bumped to make room for a liaison no one had been told to expect. Garrity sat on the edge of the rack with the green notebook closed beside her and a folded photograph open in her hands. The ship breathed around her, the long, slow groan of steel in a seaway, the distant turbine whine of the night recovery 2 decks up. She did not turn on the overhead. She did not need light to see the photograph. She had seen it 10,000 times. 3 operators on a ramp, younger. One of them her. One of them a corporal named Galen Merrick, with grease on his face and a gun in his hands. And one of them a staff sergeant named Emmett Yarrow, grinning at the camera the way a man grins who does not know how few mornings he has left. The year was 2014. She had been a major then, 35 years old, the ground force commander of a small element doing a thing that doesn't go in the news, a personnel recovery raid, a man who needed to come home, and a window of darkness to bring him through. The plan had been clean, and the night had not been. The exfil bird, a CH-53E, Corporal Galen Merrick on the ramp gun, came into the landing zone on short, final, and the zone lit up. Fire from the tree line, fire from the wall, the green snap of it cutting the dark. The pilot put the bird on the deck anyway, into a zone that had become a kill box, and held it there at the edge of its own destruction. She had keyed her radio and told the bird to lift. The pilot had answered with 3 words she had carried for 12 years. Not without your last man. So she had gone and gotten him. The numbers of that night lived in her the way scripture lives in some people. 400 meters of open ground to the casualty point and back, 11 men to load. 41 seconds the pilot held the bird past the moment any reasonable man would have lifted. She carried Corporal Isaac Pennington herself, 190 pounds of wounded Marine across her shoulders, 400 meters under fire, and put him on the ramp into Merrick's hands. Pennington lived. Pennington was a gunnery sergeant now with 2 daughters and a third on the way, and he sent her a message every 4th of October that said only, "Still here because of you." And on the perimeter, holding the last corner of the zone so the load could finish, Staff Sergeant Emmett Yarrow, call sign Starling, the funniest man she ever served with, the one who sang flat on purpose to make the young ones laugh. Yarrow was hit. The bird was at max torque. The zone was folding in. There was no second pass. There was no recovering him, and there was no time. And the worst order she ever gave in her life, she gave with her own mouth. Lift. They lifted. They left him on the steel gray ground in the dark, and his body came home on no map and no manifest, and the space where he should have been had never once, in 12 years, filled in. She had written the letter to his mother in her own hand, because a thing like that should not go out in a typed form with a signature stamped at the bottom. She had stood, weeks later, in a small kitchen in a small town, and been unable to give the woman the one thing she wanted, which was a place to bring flowers. There was no place. There was a name they would carve eventually on a board on a ship, and there was a stretch of foreign ground no flag had ever gone back to recover, and between those two there was nothing at all but the sound of a helicopter at full torque and her own voice in the dark, saying the word that lifted them off him. 11 men came off that landing zone alive. 1 did not come off at all. The arithmetic of that night had never balanced, and she had stopped, somewhere around the 5th year, expecting it to. They gave her the Silver Star for it. They gave her the call sign Vanguard 6, the one who goes in first and comes out last, the one who does not leave. She had not wanted the medal, and she had kept the call sign, because the call sign was a promise, and the medal was only a memory. She turned the watch to the inside of her wrist and breathed the count of 3. Tomorrow she would take a task force. She would stand on a flight deck, and a general would say her name, and 300 Marines would learn it all at once. But tonight, she sat in the dark with a photograph of a man whose name was on a wall and whose body was on no map, and she kept him company because keeping him company was the only thing left she could still do for him. 2 decks up, a captain slept soundly, certain that tomorrow belonged to him. Deployment Eve morning came up clear and hard, and the flight deck of the Cape Gloucester turned to. They were rigging it for a formation. The 2 birds forward were chained down tight. The CH-53I pushed aft and lashed, a podium set near the island, and a spot kept clear amidships for an inbound aircraft, a bird carrying the officer who would preside over the assumption of command. The task force was mustering on the steel, 300 and some Marines and sailors falling into ranks under the eye of the sergeant major. Dress of the line, cover and alignment, the old geometry. And Garrity was on the deck, in her flight suit, no rank on the collar, because she had not yet changed, and because she wanted to see this part too. The deck readying itself, the unit she was about to own, one more honest hour of being no one. Driscoll saw her and lost the last thread of his patience. He had spent 2 days being told, by a quiet woman who would not fight, that his deck was not as clean as he believed. He had spent 2 days watching her be right. He did not have the language for what that did to a man like him, so he reached for the only language he had. He crossed the deck at a hard walk, into the gap between the forming ranks and the deck edge, and he seized her arm, the same arm, above the elbow, the same grip as the first morning, now in full view of a task force, standing at ease. "You are off my deck," he said. "Right now. Osland." He found the lance corporal in the 2nd rank and pointed. "Fall out, and walk this civilian off my flight deck." Osland stepped one pace out of the rank and stopped. His young face was doing the thing it had never learned to hide. "Sir," he said, "I don't think she's a civilian." "That is an order, Lance Corporal." "No, sir." Osland's voice cracked on it and held. "I won't put hands on her. It's not a lawful order, sir." The deck went very quiet in the small circle around them, the way a deck goes quiet when something has slipped its track. Garrity did not resist. She let Driscoll hold her arm. She let him talk. She let the whole forming task force watch a captain grip a woman in a flight suit and call her a tourist. Her weight stayed even through both boots. The watch lay turned against the soft of her wrist. She breathed the count of 3, and somewhere in the third count, for the first time in the entire 2 days, she smiled at him. It was a small smile, and it was almost kind, and it unsettled him more than any blow would have. "You should let go of my arm, Captain," she said. "Or what?" Driscoll's voice had an edge of something underneath the bravado now, the first hairline crack. "You'll write me up? Call your contracting officer?" "Or nothing," Garrity said. "Even. Quiet. I'm telling you for your sake, Captain. Not mine." He tightened his grip. Around the small circle, the nearest Marines in the formation had gone rigid, in a way that had nothing to do with the position of attention. Vasey, 2 ranks back, had stopped breathing through his mouth. Murphy, in the 3rd rank, was staring at the captain's hand on the colonel's arm with the dawning sickness of a boy who has understood a thing 1 full second before the rest of the world catches up to him. Even the wind seemed to have taken a step back from the deck. Only Driscoll, at the dead center of it, still could not feel the ground beginning to move under his boots. 300 Marines stood in ranks on the flight deck, about to learn her name, and the only person on the steel who knew what was coming was the woman the captain was holding. And she was smiling, and the engine note of an inbound bird was already coming around the island, a half second before anyone else turned to hear it, and her chin came around to meet it first. The bird came in over the wake and settled on the clear spot amidships, and the assumption of command began. Lieutenant Colonel Corwin Hadfield, the task force executive officer, came to the center of the deck and called it to order. "Task force," he said, and the sergeant major brought them to attention. 300 bodies snapping to as one, the sound of it a single dull crack across the steel. Driscoll, near the deck edge, did not let go of the arm in his hand. He half turned toward the formation, expecting, what? To be noticed, to be received, to matter to the morning. The aircraft's ramp came down, and the presiding officer stepped onto the flight deck. A trim man, gray at the temples, in service uniform, a single star on each collar. Brigadier General Emery Sterling, Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. He paused, took the deck in once, and began to walk. Driscoll braced. The general was coming his way. The general was coming toward the deck edge, toward the captain who ran this deck, and for one last warm second, Beckett Driscoll believed the morning was finally arranging itself correctly around him. Sterling walked straight past him. He walked past the captain, as though the captain were a tie-down chain, and he stopped in front of the woman in the worn flight suit, whose arm the captain was still holding. And he removed his cover, and he came to attention, and he spoke at a volume meant only for the small circle, which was somehow louder than any shout. "Colonel Garrity," Brigadier General Sterling said, "the task force is ready for you, ma'am." The deck stopped breathing. Driscoll's hand was still on her arm, and then, from the front rank of the air operations cadre, in the carrying voice of a man who had waited 12 years and 2 days to say it, Master Gunnery Sergeant Galen Merrick said the name he had placed the first morning and the worst night. "Vanguard 6, Merrick said. "On deck." The task force moved as one animal. 300 Marines snapped from attention into the salute. the senior officer's hands coming up, the line of it rippling down the ranks and holding, a flight deck full of raised salutes held fast in the bright morning wind. Hadfield saluted. The sergeant major saluted. Osland, standing one pace out of his rank, brought his hand up with tears standing in his eyes and held it. And the face of Captain Beckett Driscoll began to come apart. Confusion first, the easy lie that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a thing that would resolve back into the world he knew. Then disbelief, as the rank in the general's mouth refused to unsay itself, as the word colonel hung in the air and would not dissolve. Then recognition, slow and total and merciless, the 2 days reassembling themselves behind his eyes in their true shape. Then horror, pure and cold, as Captain Beckett Driscoll looked down at his own hand, still wrapped around the arm of the colonel he had thrown off a flight deck twice, in front of the task force she had just come to command. He let go of her arm as if it had become a live wire. For a moment he simply stood there with the freed hand half raised, looking at it, as though it belonged to some other man and had done this thing on its own. 300 salutes were held around him in the bright wind, and not one of them was for him, and he understood, all at once, and completely, and far too late, that not one of them ever would be again. Garrity raised her right hand and returned the general's salute, clean and unhurried. She stepped past Driscoll without looking at him, walked to the podium at the center of the deck, and turned to face the task force that was now hers. She assumed command in 4 sentences, the old words, the plain ones, and her voice carried without ever rising. Then she turned, last of all, to the captain. "Captain Driscoll," she said, "you are relieved." She looked to the ship's security detail standing off at Hadfield's shoulder. "Master Chief, the captain is in your custody." The man who had said, "No civilians near my bird," stood alone in a field of 300 saluting Marines, his hand still remembering the shape of an arm it should never have touched, while the woman he had grabbed took command of every soul aboard. It came apart for Driscoll fast, the way these things do once the first seam goes. By mid-morning, they had it laid out on the wardroom table for the new commander. Lieutenant Colonel Hadfield stood at one side of the table and Master Gunnery Sergeant Merrick at the other, and between them they walked Colonel Garrity through the wreckage of Captain Beckett Driscoll's 2 days and the months behind them. The fabricated violation, signed and falsely witnessed. The removal request, routed up under his name. And then the thing Merrick had filed away without yet knowing its use, the flight deck logs, set beside the swipe card records, watch after watch that Driscoll had signed as stood, while the card reader placed him 2 decks below in his own stateroom. A flight quarters watch is a safety watch. Men work under turning rotors, trusting that someone is standing it. He had logged a dozen he never stood. There was more, and the more was the worst of it. A junior marshaller had filed a hazing complaint against Driscoll 3 months earlier, a pattern of it, the youngest and greenest men on the deck made to absorb his temper, and the complaint had been buried by the same hand that signed the false watches. Murphy's name was in it. Osland's name was in it. The boys who had been kindest to the tourist were the boys the captain had been hardest on. His own paper convicted him. Assault on a senior commissioned officer, false official statements, dereliction of duty in the standing of a safety watch, a pattern of hazing and reprisal. The charges did not need her anger. They only needed his signatures, and he had supplied them all himself. She did not raise her voice once. She read it all, asked 3 questions, and signed what needed signing for the charges to move. Driscoll would leave the ship in custody on the next available flight, relieved, his deck and his kingdom, and his certainty all taken in a single morning by a woman he had decided, on day 1, did not belong. Then she sent for the lance corporal. Casey Osland came into the wardroom braced for trouble. 19 years old, and certain he had ended his career when he told a captain no in front of a formation. Garrity stood when he came in, which made him brace harder. "Lance Corporal Osland," she said, "2 days ago you handed me a bottle of water and called me ma'am when the rest of this deck was calling me a tourist. This morning, you refused an unlawful order from a captain in front of 300 Marines, with your career sitting right there on the deck where everyone could see it. She let that land. You were the only man on my flight deck who got it right, both times." She put a commander's coin in his hand and folded his fingers over it. She was moving him onto a leadership track, she told him, under Master Guns Merrick, who would teach him the deck the right way. And she said one more thing, quietly, the only thing that mattered. "You said no to a captain because it was wrong. That is the whole job, Osland. The entire thing. Everything else is detail. Don't ever lose it." She found Murphy later and gave him a quieter word, the boy whose airway she had cleared and who had nearly stood under a falling load, and told him the deck would be different now. She found Merrick last, on the catwalk outside flight deck control, where he had been finding reasons to stand for 2 days. They did not say much. There was not much that needed saying between two people who had stood on the same patch of dark ground and walked off it carrying different weights. She set her hand on the rail beside his. 12 years, he said, and left the rest of it in the wind. 12 years, she agreed. He told her he had been certain, that night, that they were all going into the trees together at full torque, and that the only reason he had not let go of his gun was that she had not let go of the zone. She told him he had kept 11 men alive on a ramp with that gun. They let the arithmetic sit between them, the part that balanced and the part that never would, and watched the water go dark off the quarter. If you stood up a little straighter when that general walked past that captain, if something in your chest went tight when 300 Marines brought their hands up at once, then that, exactly that, is why this channel exists. Subscribe to Honor Tales, and let us go find the next one together, because there is always a next one, and they are always worth the walk. Dusk came, and the flight deck emptied, and Colonel Linnea Garrity went up to the steel alone. The wind had gone soft, and the water had gone to pewter, and the deck that had held 300 saluting Marines that morning held only her. She walked aft to the ship's small memorial board, newly dedicated, where the etched names caught the last of the light. She found the one she was looking for. 2 fingers below it, she set her hand against the cold steel. Staff Sergeant Emmett Yarrow, Starling. She took the folded photograph from her pocket and looked at it once more. 3 operators on a ramp, 2 of them now older, one of them 12 years gone. She breathed the count of 3. Her secure phone vibrated against her thigh. She drew it out. A message, a string of characters that resolved, when her eyes found the shape of it, into a greeting she had not heard since a landing zone in the dark, in a code only one man in the world had ever used to her. Vanguard 6, this is Starling. Berbera, Pier 9, the current's running. She read it twice. She looked up, out at the darkening water, where the wake rolled away toward a horizon she could no longer see. She did not smile. She did not grieve. The arithmetic of that old night, the one that had never once balanced in 12 years, shifted by a single decimal place under her feet, and she felt the deck of the whole world tilt with it. A name on a board, a city on a pier, a current running somewhere out in the dark, and a colonel who had just learned that the man she could not bring home might not be lost after all. She squared the photograph against her palm. She turned up the collar of her flight suit against the night wind, and she walked forward toward the lighted island and the task force that was hers now, the way she had always walked, first in, last out, leaving no one. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.